All right. So to start, will you please state your name?
David Hondula, Hondula.
Thank you. Next question is, will you tell me a little bit about your professional background?
Yes. I am currently in the geography program at Arizona State University, where I work on topics related to climate and health. And I came into that position from environmental sciences and climatology. I went to school at the University of Virginia. All my degrees are from there. And I think my path into environmental sciences was forged by a lifelong interest in the weather that started as a young kid.
Huh. What was there something particular about the weather that drew you onto this career path?
I don't know. I grew up in New Jersey in the eastern United States, where we had all four seasons and a variety of weather hazards, and I just thought it was really interesting, but I don't know if I could put my finger on what exactly it was about the weather.
Huh. And when and how did you get involved with research on disasters?
Of course, the Venn diagram between weather and disasters has a lot of overlap. I could make an argument that videotaping the flooding in my parents' neighborhood in the mid-1990s when the remnants of Hurricane Floyd came through was an early start in research about hazards and disasters. The first formal research project in which I participated was as an undergraduate student in the university, where we looked at how hurricanes decay as they make landfall, and we were looking to see if there was any climatic influence of the different ways that hurricanes form, if that affects how they decay. So that was my start. There was no human impacts work there, but quickly transitioned into other projects that involved human impacts.
And over the years, have you specialized in a certain type of disaster research?
Yes. Thematically, almost all of my work now is related to heat as the hazard or disaster type. And I'd say I'm less methodologically attached or focused than I am to hazard type.
And why heat?
Heat came to me after I was fairly convinced my dissertation research would be about lightning. I play golf, and lightning is a hazard for golfers. And it seems to always be the first strike that's the most dangerous. Once there's been a strike, there's pretty good decision rules about what to do. But forecasting that first strike is the real challenge. And of course, as a naive graduate student, I was sure that I could come up with an improved prediction model for lightning strikes. And then, as we were approaching dissertation proposal time, realized I was not particularly competent in electricity and magnetism, which turned out to be important parts of the lightning story. So pivot was required, and my PhD advisor was in this field called biometeorology, which I didn't know anything about, had never heard of, and turns out that biometeorology is one of the fields that studies how weather impacts humans and other organisms. And he had done all this work on heat, which I learned was a leading weather-related killer, even though it doesn't have the impressive infrastructure damage that the more violent storms would have. It adds up to really significant toll in terms of human impacts, and has these interesting physical and social layers that combine and intersect to produce who's most at risk, as is the case for other hazard types.
And then in the research that you do you focus on a particular geographic location or particular population or anything else?
Well, a lot of our work does focus on the Phoenix metropolitan area here in Arizona, which we think is one of the world's living laboratories for how people cope with a hot climate. and it's a great place to be for studying this hazard. We certainly have done, because some of our work involves administrative and retrospective data sets, those portions of the work are not as geographically tied, although I've certainly been much more domestically focused than internationally focused.
Mm-hmm. Is there one seminal disaster event that really shaped your thinking about disaster research?
I would say no. In the heat world, there are some events that people point to frequently, including the 2003 European heat wave and the 1995 Chicago heat wave. Those occurred really before the time I was deeply involved as a researcher, and I'm not necessarily expert on those events. What is shaping my experience now is the persistent, predictable, and chronic nature of the hazard here in Phoenix. In that, for example, by Ottawa standards, we would have a heat warning or heat emergency declared every day for a 3 or 4 month stretch of the season, and it's that aspect of the hazard that's really intriguing here and calls for perhaps a different paradigm or mental model in how we're thinking about responding to it.
So I'm going to probe on this a little later in the interview. That's really interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're talking about some of your work on heat, and presumably this was the focus of your research before COVID-19.
Correct.
Were you engaged in a particular study?
Yes. Several, I suppose, would be the answer. Yeah, it depends. I'm not sure what the scale is of study, but yes is definitely the answer.
And how have these various research projects been affected or disrupted by COVID-19?
That of course, seems to be the million-dollar question here. There have been a lot of different ways that the research activities have been affected by the pandemic. Of course, the practicalities and logistics of meeting and collaborating and conducting research have changed, and we can talk about that to some extent. Although I don't know, necessarily how interesting that is, not being able to access a lab space or meet with the team face to face. Although it's been a discouraging and disappointing aspect of the past several months professionally. The timing was such that the co-occurrence, the very predictable co-occurrence of the pandemic, which was not predictable, but the summer heat has really captured a lot of our attention over the past few months and catalyzed new work groups, new branches to projects, new conversations in ways that we never imagined in December, January, or arguably even into February. So I find that I and my colleagues are spending a lot of time thinking about the intersection of heat and the pandemic right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure we have some probes, so I'll sort of leave it there as an introduction, and then we can dive in deeper.
So the next question is, will you tell me about the focus of your COVID-19 research?
Yeah. Well, I'll first say that I was a little resistant to getting involved with COVID-19 research, especially, as I mentioned, I'm part of the climatology community and also part of the environmental health epidemiology community. And of course, there are a lot of researchers who are really interested to understand the factors that influence the incidence and transmission of the disease. And weather comes to mind for many folks as a possible factor. And we've seen all sorts of arguments about the role of weather. And there's a lot of, it seems like there's an audience, if you have an idea about the way that weather might impact some aspect of the pandemic, there's probably someone willing to listen to you, whether it's in a professional academic setting or in some other setting. And that, of course, would then make it very tempting to think about how future weather might influence the pandemic. But at the time, and I'm not intending to brag here, I was just really skeptical that we understood very much about disease, which I still think, of course we're learning more, but I still think is the case. And I was frustrated to see some of these studies and quasi-studies and preprints coming out that were attributing the role of weather or climate factors to 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of data from one particular site. And I was turned off and had to resist invitations to join that research. And just by coincidence, one of the journals I work with, the International Journal of Biometeorology, the editor-in-chief has recently made the decision that, with few exceptions, the journal will not be considering weather and coronavirus statistical attribution studies for at least 6 months into the future, while we wait for the time period of available data to grow and the quality of existing data to become better understood. There are just so many confounding variables right now that we're only beginning to get a grasp on, that he didn't feel comfortable even assigning those papers for review at this time. So that was what I haven't done was think about how weather is directly impacting the transmission and spread of the disease, nor am I like a virologist, so I don't really have the credentials to do so. I'd say what we have been thinking about and studying in various ways is how organizations are responding to the co-occurrence of these two hazards, the pandemic and heat, whether it's related. And we've really been coming from the heat angle, right? Thinking about, okay, we have a normal plan for summer heat. How are those plans being disrupted? How do they need to change? How do they need to evolve to deal with the pandemic? And of course, there are other people who would be thinking the opposite. Okay, here's what we need to do to respond to the pandemic. How is that complicated by heat? Here in Arizona, for example, that might be, we have long lines for testing. It's a lot of cars on hot pavement, more, air conditioners overworking in cars, people getting hot, right? That's not a great setup for testing, although, we haven't really been focusing on that. I think I recognize I'm answering the perimeter of your question, honing in on what we are doing here, so feel free to probe and nudge me along as we need to. I'd say the focal point of our activities has been a weekly teleconference that we have stood up this year with many of the city governments, the local health department, the state health department, the local weather service office, some non-governmental organizations, and a few other partners who are coming together to discuss what we're doing for heat response and preparedness this summer and how we're adapting that to the existence of the pandemic. And of course, there's a very practical applied side of these conversations, like how are you sanitizing water bottles for distribution? But as a researcher, I'm also trying to listen to see how the nature of the conversation is evolving, who's participating in the conversation, what they're adding, and so on.
And the work that you're doing with the different parts of the city governments, is this all in Phoenix, or is this in other parts of the state? Or
it is a statewide effort by name and in spirit. But here in Arizona, approximately 5 of our 7 million people live in the Phoenix metropolitan area. So all conversations are dominated by Phoenix and the Phoenix area, Maricopa County, the county that includes most of the cities in the Phoenix area. So sometimes I will use those terms interchangeably. I'll probably move between Phoenix, Maricopa County, and Arizona a little more interchangeably than I should, but the work group is meant to convene everyone in Arizona.
Okay. I'm curious to know what was the trigger or the catalyst that kind of took away your reticence to get involved in COVID research?
Well, I wanted to. I was very reluctant to get involved in this statistical work because of the types of data that were available. Short time periods, single sites, unknown quality. It just didn't seem like a recipe for success. And with sufficient tools in your statistical toolbox, we can find that anything is related to anything. And that, it just seemed like there was a big chance to kind of have like a false alarm or a false negative, whatever your preferred term would be. And that's one of the types of work I really like to do, is the statistical attribution and modeling. But it just didn't seem like the ingredients were there. We do a lot of other work on heat with city partners, county partners, and once we heard kind of murmurs that there were going to be questions about heat response related to coronavirus, that opened up a whole new door for the type of research we might do and or facilitate. So it was really the access to a different problem, if you will, that engaged me in coronavirus research. It was also the case, it was about this time that the Natural Hazard Center was convening these various working groups that I don't know if you need me to define for the purposes of the interview, but you probably have it elsewhere. And you had the opportunity to connect with many other scholars working on the intersection of other hazards and coronavirus, which I'd say was like peer encouragement, not peer pressure, but seeing all these other folks thinking about how their hazards of interest were intersecting with pandemic made me reconsider and rethink about the ways that I might be able to contribute as somebody focusing on heat.
So has Converge played any other role in facilitating your current research?
I would say indirectly. Well, I should note, and you probably have this in your records already, that Sarah McBride from the USGS and I were the leaders of one of the working groups that was stood up. And ours was on concurrent hazards and disasters, and it was on extreme weather events, geohazard events, and coronavirus. And we produced with approximately 80 scholars from all across the world a research agenda on those topics. So, yes, there is a very direct example of how Converge and the Hazard Center facilitated a particular activity. That was there was some, but not a high degree of overlap between our research here in Phoenix and that research agenda. Of course, we added content related to heat, but the working group discussion was really much broader about all hazards, and many perspectives. It was really a wonderful experience. Because of that, of course, I heard ideas and terms and concepts and people that I'm sure are infiltrating my thinking and practice around heat and coronavirus right now. I probably couldn't put my finger on them at this moment for you, but I'm sure there was an influence in one way or another.
Okay. Well, that's great to hear. Great to hear. With the research that you're doing on organizational responses to heat and the pandemic, what are the goals for this study? What are you hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, you joked about the adaptability of researchers at the start of our call, and I think that is emblematic of our approach to this research /conversation /work group right now. Is we recognized it was really important to help facilitate this regional statewide dialogue in April, I suppose it was, and I think objective one was to create a space for people to have this conversation and figure out how to make X intervention work during the pandemic. And that's not always the role for a university to play. There might be other organizations that could play that role. I think universities often play that role as a convener and creators of discussion space, and that's certainly the case for heat in the Phoenix area. I think the universities are seen as playing that role in a large way. But I think we went into this with the practical need first, and anticipated that there would be research questions and objectives that would become apparent as the conversation went along. And that has been the case. If I were to give you some of those objectives right now, I'd be curious if they are the questions that we will have answered 8 to 10 months from now when we speak next. So for example, we're interested in understanding how the landscape of interventions or solutions for heat is impacted by coronavirus. How does individual exposure change to heat because of the virus? How is the structure, nature, personnel of organizational response impacted by the pandemic? One of our colleagues, for example, in the first couple of weeks that this was going, actually the very first conversation we had of all things was about ramadas in parks, kind of shade structures. We call them ramadas. You might just call them I'm not sure what they'd be called there. And as we were planning to close the parks, playgrounds and all of that, there was a question about what to do with ramadas. We also had the two conversations we're having concurrently. We had our first heat warning of the season coming in April, the earliest in recorded history here, and we're making this decision about what to do with parks. We, the general we, not me, of course. And the question was, what are we going to do about these ramadas? Folks are going to, especially folks who don't have homes, are going to be seeking shelter in these ramadas to try to get out of the sun, to try to get out of the heat. Should we close them or not? And I remember very clearly my colleague said, the folks who usually would make this decision are in the emergency operations center dealing with pandemic emergency right now. Nobody's thinking, and they need to think an hour ahead, a day ahead, 2 days ahead. Nobody's thinking a week ahead, 2 weeks ahead, 4 weeks ahead. So I'm assuming that role. This was a sustainability manager in one of the cities here. So I need to slide into that role. And I think we've seen similar adaptation and flexibility. I don't know what to make of it all yet. We're still in the thick of it. But I think that those evolving roles has been a really interesting part of the conversation. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, but
in a roundabout way. So just as a follow-up, actually two follow-ups. The first is this the usual approach that you use in your research? So first guided by more practical ideas and then evolving into a more theoretical, scholarly side, or do you usually do it the other way around?
I think it's usually the other way around because usually, but not always, in that many of our projects are come from federal scientific funding agencies or have their roots in scholarship rather than application. And as such, they start with some question related to theory or a concept or a framework, and we build up from there. Now, here at perhaps my personal nature, but also the kind of culture of the institution here, ASU, is very applied and solutions focused, and we have a lot of encouragement and support to do so. So I feel like more so than some of my colleagues at some places, that very public, outward-facing aspect of the research is a very consistent thread as well. In this particular case, I think you're right in that the model is more the exception than the norm. In that, the conversation was, here's some activity that needs to happen. We'll figure out exactly what we're doing from a research front later, but let's get everybody together and start having this conversation. That does not occur typically. That has not occurred typically in my experience here thus far. Okay.
So then, with this more practical focus, are you expecting the findings to be taken up more by city officials and people in more practice-oriented roles?
Well, that has been the primary focus of the conversation, and then and just going back to your previous question as well, I've been, especially over the past month or two, trying to map research questions onto this activity that has spun up. Thinking about, it was only where are we now? 3 months in? Yeah, only 2 or 3 months in where there was the first mention of, well, this might be interesting for a scientific manuscript. That was not on the table, not even thought about one way or another at the start of this project. But now all of a sudden, it seems like there are many opportunities to contribute not only to the practical day-to-day here, but also here and elsewhere, but also contribute to scholarship, which is exciting and encouraging, especially for young faculty members who might have evaluations and promotions and other things ahead of them, who are participating very enthusiastically in these work groups.
So are you one of those younger faculties who are, or faculty members who need these research publications for promotion and tenure?
I'm not a full professor, so yes, in one form or another.
Okay.
But I also recently was promoted up one level, so I don't feel the pressure as much as some others might.
Okay. For the research, are there particular concepts or theories that are guiding the work?
Yeah, I'd say that's a moving, that's an evolving conversation. We're certainly, a lot of the academics who are participating in the working group have roots in social vulnerability. I'm not sure theory is the right term to use, but at least as a conceptual framework, that seems to be somewhat of a debated topic. But a lot of the folks involved have roots in one form or another in the social vulnerability lineage from geography and neighboring disciplines. And relatedly, there's a environmental justice and equity base. And these aren't necessarily individual specific theories, but more, I guess, the intellectual neighborhoods in which we're living. That is, that's probably our conceptual home right now. I don't know. As I hear some hazards and disasters researchers say that they feel like our field is pretty theory sparse, and I don't know if that's true. But I've heard that perception, and I guess perhaps the nature of my response here is in and of itself an answer to your question, as a maybe. And here are some ideas.
So are these overarching themes, approaches of environmental justice and equity and social vulnerability ones that you have used in previous work?
Absolutely.
And so how have you adapted these approaches from your previous work into the work that you're doing now?
Well, I think that has helped us start, even entering the work group conversations, really, I think we were already thinking about populations, people, circumstances that might typically be associated with high danger or risk to heat, rather than just the world that we live in is thinking about who the vulnerable populations are, why they're vulnerable, what needs to be done for them, short-term plus long-term structural. So I think that shaped our approach and the conversations that we've been having with this work group. But as I think we imagine that the pandemic has thrown a curveball in our heat response activities, and it's also thrown a curveball in our understanding of the vulnerability landscape, which we're still figuring out. So I don't have a definite answer for you, but there are likely some populations for whom heat-related risks are amplified because of the pandemic, and there might be populations for whom the risk is attenuated because of the pandemic, and we're of course, trying to adjust and adapt our conversation accordingly. So I think, I'm not sure I directly answered your question, but I think we as the academics are rechecking our understanding of vulnerability to heat in the light of the pandemic.
You had mentioned before that part of the research involves weekly teleconferences. What are some of the other primary methods that you're using in this project?
Isn't everything a teleconference? So there's a weekly high level, well, not high level, but there's a weekly all hands call, if you will, really for whoever wants to be involved. And then from that conversation, there are smaller working groups that have broken out and also meet virtually and regularly. There are, and those work groups have spun up some individual activities. There are certainly what we might call frontline practitioners who are involved, who they are counting the number of water bottles they're distributing, observing who's coming into facilities, seeking heat relief or other services. There's a survey, a telephone-based survey that's been stood up from one of the work groups. So there's growing tentacles of research activities, but the weekly conversation has really been the heart or the genesis of it all. There's a weekly conversation with everybody, which is a rotating cast of 40 folks, I would say, and there's a total roster probably of 80 to 100 who might show up at any one time. There's a steering committee of 6 people who also meet separately, and then there are 2 working groups, one specifically focused on cooling centers and one focused on communication strategies that meet at least weekly.
Okay, that's a really big group to be working with.
There are a lot of folks involved. Although there are, as I'm sure is the case for any group of 40 to 80 to 100 that you've been involved with, there are a lot of folks who are very happy to listen, and that's totally fine by us. There's of course no way you could have a productive conversation with. Well, I shouldn't say there's no way, but having 80 people meaningfully contribute to a 60-minute dialogue would be very challenging. So a lot of the times, City might just say we have no updates from our last update, and we'll move along from there. So it's of course there are varying levels of engagement and participation, but even just even if there are 30 folks on the line who never say anything and just hear how one city is dealing with one particular aspect of this dual hazard situation, we see some benefit there.
So these collaborations that you have with the city officials, are these existing collaborations or are these new ones that have come out of the project?
Yeah, fantastic question, and I'll say that I think this is going to be a great example of activity that the pandemic has catalyzed that will, over the long term, be a positive. Right now it feels like we're sort of scrambling and threw this thing together, but really this conversation should happen. My opinion right now, anyway, is that it should happen every summer. And I think there are other aspects of the pandemic that I'm not expert in where we'll see this as well. I don't know if it's masks or hand sanitizer or washing your hands or whatever it is, but I think there are going to be some remnants of the pandemic that stick around in society for a while because they make sense. And in the absence of the pandemic, I don't think we would have stood up to this working group. So I think that in some ways the pandemic forced us to innovate and collaborate in a way that we hadn't before, and we probably will continue to do so into the foreseeable future. So that being said, now to answer your direct question, this conversation has certainly brought new people this activity has brought new people into the heat conversation. There's been a pretty robust regional engagement around heat here for several years, although that might have been an annual meeting organized by the State Health Department or another type of infrequent activity. What's happening here on a weekly basis now, I think, has not only up to the level of participation from some of the folks who might have been participating anyway, but also brought new people to the conversation.
And how did you connect with all of these new offices and new people in the different municipalities?
It was all through the network, through the grapevine. For example, the city of Phoenix has a few folks who have been leading their heat engagement for several years, and once the email was shared with them that there was this idea to get this weekly call, feel free to invite anyone else that you think would benefit from participating or enjoy participating. And then they were making those connections in their head and then practically forwarding the message along. So it was a kind of a multi-snowballing approach, if you will.
Okay.
And it's been very, very organic and fluid. And if you like being in control of activities, like this is definitely not the project for you.
Why is that?
I think just as we learn from week to week who's involved in it. The attendance is unpredictable. I mean, it's somewhat predictable, but we don't always know who's going to show up. New folks are added to the conversation. The boundaries are ever changing and growing, and that's fine and great from our perspective as folks come to identify that this is useful for them, or maybe not, and drop off.
Huh. And on the research side of things, are you collaborating with other researchers?
There are several academics involved from the two major public universities in the state, ASU and the University of Arizona. And there are, let me think about this. I cannot think of an academic involved with whom I have not interacted with in some way previously, although this activity has created opportunities for new or stronger collaborations. I was trying to run through the participant list in my head. For example, there's a communications researcher who we have known each other for several years and always talked about doing something together, but never really got anything off the ground. And now, now there may be a really interesting opportunity for a study on risk communication and conflict in messaging around these two hazards. So, an example of a not totally new collaboration, but one that I think could take a big step forward.
Mm-hmm. And are you collaborating?
I don't know if what I just said is true for all of the researchers involved. There might be some new connections that have been made. I can't picture the full social network map in my mind right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some new connections that have been made.
Are the people, are the academics who are involved all faculty members, or are there also students involved?
There are students involved, undergraduate and graduate students, and there are research faculty, postdoc equivalent types involved as well.
Okay. Wow. So it's the whole spectrum then.
The whole spectrum, from the most senior professor who's threatening to retire, next year and has been, for several years, to an undergraduate student participating in their first summer RE research experiences for undergraduate project.
Okay. Wow. So if we interview this undergraduate student in 10 or 20 years, then this may be the disaster that they mention as the seminal one that shaped their thinking. about
this could be what turns them off from hazards and disease research permanently and toward computer science or something else, yes. That's a perfect example of the way that the conversation has adapted in that we had sketched out plans for a summer undergraduate project looking at water availability in the city during the summer. So mapping the geography of water availability, whether it's from water fountains or convenience stores or so on, which is you'll have to trust me that it's a more interesting topic than it sounds like. And those plans were all crafted in the fall and involved in-person visits to many places and so on and so forth. And there were practical aspects of that just weren't going to work out very well this summer. And then another great opportunity and need to think about access, not only to water but also to heat refuges or cooling centers, as they're called here. So the nature of the REU project itself has evolved.
Actually, the question of water availability in public places is actually quite interesting personally to me because I run.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
So having access to water along my route is quite nice. So going back to some of the methods, what sort of adjustments have you had to make in the methods that you're using for the research as compared to the methods that you would use in a non-pandemic situation?
Are we thinking broadly across different research projects?
So the methods that you are using in the COVID research, how you've had to adapt them from your pre-COVID research.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's a good question. And why I'm pausing a little bit and trying to answer your question is that because what I would consider to be my main heat and COVID activity was only catalyzed because of the pandemic, there's not a how we did this last year to think back on because we weren't doing this last year. But thinking about how things might be different than they could be next year or might have been otherwise. Obviously all meetings are happening virtually. How else might they be different? I guess we're relying on sort of photographs and like verbal testimony rather than making our own observations of what's happening at sites or facilities. In a non-pandemic summer, we'd probably be visiting in a non-pandemic summer when a pandemic was occurring that we were interested in studying, we'd be interested to visit all of the cooling centers to understand what their response strategy looked like, and we're not doing that because of the pandemic. But again, that would be somewhat less interesting to do if it weren't for the pandemic. Hopefully you sense a little bit of difficulty in my thinking about how to answer this question. Can you bump me in any directions here? I'm sorry, I'm stalling on my thinking a little bit.
The weekly teleconferences, it sounds like, I would imagine that it's likely that would have happened in person or a hybrid of some people calling in.
Yeah, I think that would have been a hybrid activity. Well, I can say this, that we had plans for an in-person annual statewide heat preparedness meeting in April that did not happen, and some of the conversation that would have happened at that in-person meeting has transitioned into this phone call. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but it does show in some ways the replacement of an in-person activity with virtual activity.
For some of the researchers whose work is more place-based, so doing interviews, in-person interviews, so those would be some of the other methods that other researchers have had to adapt or abandon entirely depending on which groups they work with. So that's part of where this question was coming from.
Yeah, that's that has been the case for some of the other projects that we were doing that aren't as closely tied to the pandemic itself. For example, just earlier this morning, I was delivering temperature monitors to homes, which turns out to be a good idea in the pandemic anyway, or maybe even especially so. And we had imagined that we would be doing the installation of these sensors and helping people set up the software and so on and so forth. And that's not happening. Instead, I discreetly or sneakily snuck up on the patio and dropped off the package with contactless delivery and ran back to my car with my mask on. And then we'll be having like a phone version of tech support later today or tomorrow to help everybody get set up, which we think will be less efficient and more frustrating for everybody involved, but nonetheless is what's necessary.
Wow. So that answers that question. What is the expected duration of the project?
I was just thinking about that yesterday, wondering how many more weeks we were going to go. Our plan that we announced at the start of this in April was that we would go sometime until mid to late September, which is when our probability of severe heat really starts to taper off. So that's our current plan, is that the actual convenings will be happening for another 8 weeks, give or take. But of course there will be more after action work to do in the months thereafter. So I currently have no clue when when the research about how heat response and heat impacts will change because of the pandemic will end. I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening for years into the future.
Okay. So the data collection, data construction period for this particular part of the project until September-ish, and then you had mentioned before that some of the research collaborations that have come out or have deepened because of this project will likely lead to longer-term projects.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, and just an example of something that will happen. Everybody participating in the work group is really concerned about the number of heat illnesses and fatalities that we'll observe this year. And there are preliminary data that are updated weekly, but the final data set won't really exist until next January or February in terms of the total number of cases for 2020. So it won't be until February or March next year when we're even really capable of starting the retrospective investigation of who died from heat this summer and the extent to which the pandemic might have influenced that, which is very much of interest to everybody in the working group, almost everybody, I suppose.
Yeah. What do you anticipate to be, or what are the primary challenges associated with conducting your COVID-19 work?
With the work, and when you say work there,
with the research
as a researcher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have the sense for myself and for my colleagues that this Zoom world is very tiring, and that we lose some of the sort of enthusiasm and inspiration and creativity that might come from in-person meetings. I'll be curious to see what I say 8 to 10 months from now, but I feel like that in-person interaction and all of the intangibles that come with that has likely been a major impact. Some of our field-based research has been impacted in predictable ways, whether it's wearing personal protective equipment, going out to replace weather stations, taking fewer people, doing that work solo, conducting interviews by telephone or video conference instead of in person. But those don't seem to me to be quite as impactful as just that lack of contact and eye contact. You just miss all that. Mm-hmm. Now, had I a couple of weeks ago, I was replacing weather stations by myself, not wanting to bring any student assistants along, and had I fallen off the ladder that I was climbing by myself and broken my leg, I might have a different answer for you. But fortunately, that did not happen. But I guess I did take on a little extra risk in doing some field work as a consequence of the pandemic, trying to mitigate risk, to myself and others for disease transmission.
That's a really interesting decision to have to make. So, how to prioritize which risk.
We could have done it, with multiple people and just been super careful about it. But it seems easier in some ways just to go solo and knock it out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And especially with students, I think an important aspect, the faculty-student dynamic has been something I've been thinking about, and I think we will all need to think about moving into the academic year. In a normal operating time, hey students, I'm going to run to this field site. Would you mind swinging by the lab and get these other things ready, and I'll come back and pick them up going to field site number 2. And even that the simple just the simple division of labor, it has to happen in a totally different way. I'm not comfortable asking a student. I'm not even sure allowed to ask students to go into the building to do work yet. Or if we are able to do that, it's just become possible to do so as various safety protocols have been approved and so on. But that has added a layer of sort of thinking and planning onto our activities.
So how have you managed this added layer of not having the same degree of support from say, students?
I've driven around a lot more than than I otherwise might. And just trying to think of different ways that students can support the work. It's not like folks aren't still eager to participate and be involved, but there are some activities. We've traded roles in some ways for what we're doing on various projects, where I think the institution is more comfortable with me assuming whatever risk might be associated with going to the building, or whatever responsibility might be associated with going to the building versus the students. And it happens to be the case that some of our, really all, the 3 graduate students with whom I most closely work, they all are in special circumstances in which they are either regularly exposed, they either have higher regular exposure, or they have high interaction with potentially sensitive groups. So it's like kind of an extra precaution needed for our group in particular.
Okay.
Whereas I'm not in that thing. I don't live with an elderly family member. I'm not regularly interacting with high-risk populations. So aside from the faculty-student power dynamic, however it might exist, there's also just the fact that the nature of my day-to-day interactions might make it much more comfortable for me to be in a public setting or in a laboratory or something like that. And I could see other teams where that is the opposite.
So with a faculty member who could potentially be more at risk or in a position where they're putting other people at risk.
Maybe there's a student who lives by themselves, never interacts with anybody, high risk, doesn't really have high exposure, and it would make more sense for them to be doing whatever public laboratory-facing activity there was. But I do, I'm trying to be extra sensitive to checking myself that I shouldn't I should never even come close to implying that any student should take on any risk they're not comfortable taking on.
Is that the messaging that you're getting from the institution, or is that something that you are initiating as the primary investigator and the faculty?
We have got messaging from the institution at various levels that students should not be at the building, and really nobody should be at the building, but especially students. And if faculty need to be there in a limited capacity, they can do so, but it's discouraged. So we've heard that as kind of the law of the land, and then how that implemented, I imagine, is highly variable.
So it's a new responsibility for researchers is having to play police officer in deciding who...
And risk manager.
Yeah. Oh. So we're getting near the...
Fortunately, I'll say what has made that a little easier for me is that our group, we have an interest in health. We collaborate with public health. We have folks who work, like intern with public health. But so we are pretty close to the public health conversation, and are a part of it. So there's no great mystery about what public health recommendations are. How to err on the side of safety. I feel like that's I'm fortunate that that's infused in our DNA already, so we're not having arguments, and everybody's contributing to a dialogue on culture around safety and best practices.
So I have 2 more questions for you. I know that we've gone over our 60 minutes, and
that was my fault. So that wasn't
I'm quite flexible with my time, but I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Well, thank you.
Much like everyone else, your day-to-day life is probably being affected by the pandemic. What are some of the changes to your personal life that are impacting your professional life and your research?
Yeah, good question. I feel like less organized and less ahead of the game. Not that I'm ever ahead of the game, but less ahead of the game than usual. I mean, just like everybody else, kind of an improvised workplace at home with different screens, and the papers are in different stacks, and just nothing is the whole system that I've been, whatever system it might have been, but my workplace procedures that I had developed or become habituated to over the course of a few years were completely uprooted, and now have been in the course of figuring that all out all over again. I feel slower, and I feel more likely to make mistakes in scheduling, and even our interaction at the start of today's call was like a perfect example of a kind of unforeseen but very predictable, somewhat predictable, a problem I should have had figured out in advance. So I feel more scrambling, more improvised, a little more frustrated in the day-to-day, just as a result of the changed workplace environment. My wife is also an academic, also working from home, so we've tried to manage our schedules such that we both aren't having the highest importance video conferences at the same time to preserve bandwidth and so on. I don't even know if that's really a concern, but my perception is that it is. So we do try to do some schedule coordinating like that, which of course has cascading effects in coordinating schedules with others and so on. I feel so okay from like a mental health and well-being standpoint. So I don't feel yeah, I don't feel like that's trickled in too much, although maybe I'll feel totally differently 8 to 10 months from now. And then, this is a really roundabout connection, but because of the pandemic, of course, we're at home a lot, which means we're spending a lot more time walking around the neighborhood and so on and so forth. And in doing so, we saw a house for sale in the neighborhood that caught our eye, and we had just been joking about moving for a year or so, using a house with a little bigger floor plan, thinking ahead to the future. And had it not, so we wound up touring the house and one thing led to another, and I'm actually now talking to you from the new house. So we have been moving during the pandemic, and I don't know that would have happened if it wasn't for the pandemic. And of course, moving is highly disruptive to all aspects of life, particularly the style move that we're doing. We're moving 500 feet down the street from where we were. So it's been just nonstop for the past 6 weeks, moving a little bit at a time. So can't really blame that directly on the pandemic, but I don't know that it would have happened in the absence of the pandemic, which was just, when you're thinking about an improvised workplace setup and papers everywhere and this and that, that's been an added layer of fun.
Wow. I don't know if I would call that fun, but I'm glad that it's fun for you.
It's been entertaining, for sure.
Wow. And my last question for you is, what have been the consequences, if any, of the demonstrations following the death of George Floyd on you and on your research?
Oh, good question. I think, like many of my colleagues, just provided a little bit of an opportunity for reflection on what we're doing, why we're doing it, why is it important, how is it impacting different people, and we've had similar messaging coming in from the institution to take time, reflect, reprioritize. Some of the members of our team are have been involved in various ways in those types of activities in the years leading up to this. So it's not like a totally new conversation for us to be near. We had some of the students with whom I work were particularly impacted by this in terms of their health and well-being, which has led to schedule adjustments and delays and postponement. But that hasn't been a problem, by any means. It's just given everybody time and space to take care of themselves and each other. And so that has been an impact for me, but not necessarily a negative one, or not a negative one. Just has been an impact.
So those are all the questions that I have for you for today. Before I close,
yeah, these are a fantastic set of questions, and you got me thinking a little bit. So I hope it was enjoyable for you, but it was for me.
Yes, very much. Before I close off, I have one quick comment, and then the question was, do you have any questions for me?
I'm going to have a million questions for you in 8 to 10 months, but my only comment for you is I applaud the work that your team is doing, and wish you well as you are going through these interviews. And I'm sure you're hearing a lot of interesting stories, and good and bad. And hope you're doing well as you hear about everybody's struggles and successes.
Yeah. No, it's pretty exciting work, because we're getting to see the different kinds of work that researchers are doing now, and it's a pretty broad spectrum. So it's exciting to see the different kinds of research projects, and also how different people are responding to the changes, and how some things are the same, some things are different, some things are sparking new opportunities, and it's been super interesting. So,
yeah, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to mention briefly, I was excited to talk to you today as well, because one of the big stories in the news here in Montreal is that a number of the public pools have had to be shut down for a couple of weeks because the lifeguards had an initiation party, and someone had COVID-19, and so as a precautionary measure, the city's strategy to open up pools as their heat wave mitigation strategy is now being foiled. So all of these people who were supposed to be going to the pools can't do it because
that's like, unfortunately, just perfect perfect concurrent hazard risk amplifier. Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry if that has changed your pool plans for the immediate future. But hopefully that situation gets resolved soon.
Yeah.
We've been here. It seems like we've been bouncing back and forth between pools open and closed. As you've probably seen, Arizona is sort of back in the ban zone for cases. So we had pools open for a little bit, but I think they have closed back down.
Yeah.
So yes, an evolving situation.
Okay. Well, I wish you well with your research and with living through this pandemic and everything else. And I'll touch base again in 8 to 10 months to schedule a follow-up interview. And in the interim, if you have any questions, then email me or you can contact Liesl.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Christine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon.